In a packed lecture hall at the University of New Hampshire, Professor Daniel Hargrove scoffed. Jesus, just a fairy tale for the gullible. Karoline Leavitt, a quiet young woman in the back, sat still, her cross necklace hidden, her calm unshaken. No one noticed her, not yet, but she wasn't just another student. She was the youngest White House spokesperson in history. So why was she here? Letting his words sting what happens when the truth steps forward. Before we dive into today's story, if you find this video interesting, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any upcoming stories. You're also welcome to leave a comment and share your thoughts. Every piece of feedback is truly valuable in helping Crossfire Justice improve. Thank you so much for always being with us. And now, let's jump into this thrilling and unexpected story together. The lecture hall at the University of New Hampshire was a cavern of restless energy, filled with the low hum of students flipping through notebooks or tapping on phones. Professor Daniel Hargrove stood at the front, his voice sharp and commanding, slicing through the chatter like a well-aimed dart. Jesus Christ, just a fairy tale spun by desperate men, he declared, a smirk curling his lips as he leaned against the podium, savoring his own cleverness. The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling unease through the room. In the back row, Karoline Leavitt sat quietly, her modest gray sweater blending into the sea of hoodies and backpacks. Her chest tightened not with anger, but with the weight of a truth she'd carried since childhood. If you've ever felt your beliefs mocked in a room full of strangers, you'd know that ache. Her fingers brushed the silver cross necklace tucked beneath her collar, its cool metal grounding her. She didn't flinch or frown, but her hazel eyes stayed fixed on Hargrove, who was already moving to his next slide, oblivious to the young woman he'd just dismissed. Around her, students reacted in fragments. Some chuckled nervously, others nodded in agreement, and a few averted their eyes, uncomfortable but silent. Hargrove's words weren't new in academic circles, but here, in this public space, they felt like a gauntlet thrown down, daring anyone to pick it up. Karoline's posture remained unassuming, almost invisible, but there was a stillness to her that didn't match the restless energy of the room. She wasn't just another student scribbling notes. There was something about her, something Hargrove hadn't noticed, and maybe never would. The professor's voice droned on, weaving more barbs about blind faith into his lecture, each one landing a little heavier on Karoline's shoulders. She didn't speak, not yet. Her hand rested on her notebook, where a single line was written in neat script: Tacitus, Annals 1544. It wasn't a random note, it was a reminder, a tether to a truth she'd studied for years, not just in books but in the quiet moments of her life. Sitting with her father as he spoke of faith and history, the lecture hall felt smaller now, the air thicker, as if the room itself was holding its breath. A student to Karoline's left, a lanky boy with earbuds dangling, leaned over and whispered to his friend, "Is she going to say something?" His voice was low, but it carried a spark of curiosity, like he sensed the tension building. Karoline didn't turn to look at him. Her gaze stayed on Hargrove, who was now gesturing broadly, inviting questions with a patronizing wave of his hand. The challenge hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. "Go ahead. Try me." Karoline's fingers tightened around her pen, not out of fear, but out of resolve. She wasn't here to argue for sport. She was here because something deeper had been touched, a line crossed, not just for her, but for anyone who'd ever been told their truth didn't matter. The room buzzed again, students shifting in their seats, some already packing up as the lecture neared its end. Hargrove's smirk hadn't faded, his confidence unshaken. He hadn't seen Karoline yet, not really. But as he turned to his laptop, ready to dismiss the class, A single hand rose in the back of the room. It was hers. The boy next to her froze, his whisper unanswered. The lecture hall at the University of New Hampshire felt heavier now, the air thick with the residue of Professor Daniel Hargrove's words. Karoline Leavitt sat in the back row, her hands folded neatly over her notebook, the silver cross necklace tucked completely out of sight beneath her gray sweater. She was still, almost too still, as if her calm was a deliberate shield against the storm of mockery swirling around her. Hargrove, oblivious to the young woman in the corner, pressed on with his lecture, his voice dripping with theatrical disdain. "Blind faith," he said, waving a hand like a conductor dismissing a flawed note, "is what keeps people tethered to myths like Jesus Christ." The room responded with scattered laughs, some genuine, others forced. As students shifted in their seats, a few glanced at Karoline, their eyes flickering with curiosity or pity, expecting her to flinch or fire back, but she didn't. She only jotted a note in her notebook, her pen moving with quiet precision. Josephus, Antiquities 20, 200. If you've ever been judged for what you hold dear, for the quiet truths you carry in your heart, this moment was for her. Her calm wasn't weakness, it was something deeper, something Hargrove couldn't see. Across the room, Emily, the teaching assistant, leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed and her lips curled in a smirk that mirrored Hargrove's. She was young, maybe a few years older than Karoline, with sharp eyes that scanned the room for any sign of dissent. When her gaze landed on Karoline, it lingered, narrowing slightly, as if sizing up an opponent who hadn't yet declared themselves. Karoline didn't meet her stare. Instead, her pen paused, hovering over the page. As a memory flickered in her mind, she was 16, sitting at her father's kitchen table in their small New Hampshire home, the smell of coffee and old books in the air. Her father, a pastor with hands worn from years of turning Bible pages, had looked at her with steady eyes. "Karoline," he'd said, "the world will test your faith. Stand firm, but don't let anger speak for you." Those words anchored her now, keeping her rooted as Hargrove's voice filled the room again, mocking the deluded who clung to ancient stories. The students around her were a mixed chorus of reactions. The lanky boy to her left, his earbuds now tucked into his pocket, whispered to his friend, "She's not gonna let that slide, right?" His friend shrugged, eyes darting to Karoline, waiting for a spark. But Karoline's face gave nothing away. Her hazel eyes, soft but unyielding, stayed fixed on her notebook, where her notes weren't just about the lecture, they were a map of her thoughts, a quiet rebellion forming in ink. She wasn't here by accident. She'd chosen this lecture, knowing Hargrove's reputation for dismantling faith with a scholar's arrogance. She'd come prepared, not to fight, but to listen, to weigh his words against the truth she'd studied for years. Her father had taught her to question, to seek evidence, to build her faith on something stronger than sentiment. That's why the cross necklace, a gift from him, felt like more than jewelry. It was a reminder of who she was, even when no one else saw it. Hargrove's lecture was winding down now, his slides flashing images of ancient texts he claimed disproved religious narratives. He paced the front of the room, his confidence unshaken, his voice rising as he invited questions with a flourish. "Come on. Anyone brave enough to challenge me?" he said, his tone half joking, half daring. The room stirred, students exchanging glances, but no one spoke. Emily, still by the door, tilted her head, her smirk fading slightly as she noticed Karoline's hand resting on her notebook, the pen no longer moving. There was something about that stillness, that quiet focus, that felt out of place in a room buzzing with nervous energy. Karoline's chest rose with a slow breath, her fingers brushing the edge of her notebook where her father's words lived in her memory. She wasn't angry, not yet, but she was ready. The lecture ended with a rustle of backpacks and the scrape of chairs. Students began to file out, some still chuckling at Hargrove's quips, others lost in their phones. Hargrove lingered at the podium, packing his laptop, his posture relaxed, as if he'd just won a game no one else was playing. Any questions he called out, almost as an afterthought, his eyes scanning the room but not really expecting a response. That's when Karoline raised her hand. Her movement was subtle, unhurried, but it cut through the noise like a signal. The room seemed to freeze, heads turning, eyes locking onto her. The lanky boy beside her leaned forward, his breath catching. Emily straightened, her arms uncrossing, her expression shifting to something unreadable. Hargrove looked up, his smirk faltering for a fraction of a second as he registered the raised hand in the back. Karoline's voice, when it came, was steady but soft, carrying a weight that didn't match her unassuming appearance. "Professor," she said, "I have a question." The words hung in the air, simple but charged, like the first note of a song no one expected to hear. The lecture hall at the University of New Hampshire had fallen into a hushed stillness, the kind that comes when a room full of people senses something is about to shift. Karoline Leavitt stood in the back row, her modest gray sweater and unassuming posture at odds with the clarity in her voice. "Professor," she said, her words cutting through the lingering echo of laughter, "your claim about Jesus lacks historical context. Can we discuss Tacitus or Josephus?" The question wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made heads turn. Professor Daniel Hargrove, still leaning against the podium, froze for a moment, his confident smirk faltering before twisting into something sharper, more condescending. "A freshman citing Roman historians," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Cute, but this isn't Sunday school. Sweetheart." The room erupted in uneasy laughter, a nervous ripple that spread from the front rows to the back. Karoline's cheeks flushed, not from shame, but from the sting of being dismissed so publicly. Her carefully chosen words reduced to a punchline. Emily, the teaching assistant, stood by the door, her arms still crossed, her eyes narrowing as she muttered under her breath, "She's just grandstanding." Her words were meant for no one in particular, but they reached the students nearby, who nodded or smirked in agreement. Karoline didn't flinch, though the weight of their gazes pressed against her. She felt it, the judgment, the assumption that she was out of her depth, a naive girl clutching at straws. But beneath that weight was something else, something solid, the memory of her father's voice, steady and sure, reading from ancient texts at their kitchen table. "Truth doesn't bend to scorn," he'd told her once, his calloused hand resting on her shoulder. That memory anchored her now, keeping her eyes locked on Hargrove, who leaned forward, his sneer daring her to continue. "Go on, enlighten us," he said, his voice thick with sarcasm, as if he were indulging a child. Around her, the students were no longer packing their bags or scrolling on their phones. They were watching, some with amusement, others with curiosity, a few with unease. Phones were raised, their tiny screens capturing the moment, the soft clicks of video recordings blending with the hum of the room. The lanky boy to Karoline's left, his earbuds now forgotten, leaned forward, his eyes wide as he whispered to his friend, "She's not backing down." His friend didn't respond, too focused on Karoline, whose hands rested lightly on her notebook, her pen still poised over the page where she'd written, "Tacitus, Annals 1544. She wasn't just a student throwing out names to sound smart. She'd spent years studying, not just for grades, but for herself, for the faith that had shaped her life. Hargrove's dismissal wasn't new, she'd heard it before, in different rooms, from different voices. But here, in this lecture hall, with hundreds of eyes on her, it felt like a line had been drawn, and she was being asked to step over it. Karoline took a slow breath, her chest rising as she steadied herself. She wasn't angry, not in the way Hargrove might have expected, with raised voices or clenched fists. Her anger was quieter, a deep ache for the truth she knew was being trampled. Tacitus, she said, her voice steady, wrote in 116 AD about Christ's execution under Pontius Pilate. Josephus, in his Antiquities, mentions Jesus twice. These are historical records. Professor, not fairy tales. The words were simple, measured, but they landed like stones in the room's silence. Hargrove's smirk didn't vanish, but it tightened, his eyes narrowing as he processed her response. He hadn't expected this, not from the quiet girl in the back, not from someone he'd already written off. The students stirred, some exchanging glances, others typing furiously on their phones, the moment already spilling onto social media. Emily shifted her weight, her arms uncrossing, her expression flickering with something new. Uncertainty, maybe, or the first hint of respect. Hargrove straightened, his hands gripping the edge of the podium. "So you've read a few Wikipedia pages," he said, his voice louder now, as if volume could reclaim his authority. "That doesn't make your Bible stories history." The laughter came again, but it was thinner this time, less certain. Karoline's fingers brushed the edge of her notebook, where her father's lessons lived in her careful handwriting. She could feel the weight of his words, his faith, her own years of study pressing against this moment. She wasn't here to win an argument. She was here to stand for something larger, something Hargrove's scorn couldn't touch. But the room was watching, waiting, and the air felt charged, like the pause before a storm. A student in the front row turned fully in her seat, her eyes wide, whispering to her friend, "She's not done." Is she? Karoline's gaze didn't waver from Hargrove, her silence louder than his taunts. Something was about to break open, and everyone could feel it. The lecture hall at the University of New Hampshire was no longer just a room, it was a stage, and every eye was on Karoline Leavitt. She stood in the back row, her voice growing firmer, each word deliberate, like stones laid carefully to build a path. Tacitus wrote of Christ's execution under Pontius Pilate in 116 AD. She said, her hazel eyes locked on Professor Daniel Hargrove. Josephus mentioned Jesus twice in his Antiquities. These aren't fairy tales, Professor, they're historical records. Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried a quiet power, the kind that makes a room fall silent. Hargrove, still gripping the podium, scoffed, his smirk twisting into something defensive. "You're quoting Wikipedia now, are you?" he said, his voice sharp, meant to cut her down, but a flicker of doubt crossed his face, barely noticeable, like a crack in a dam. Karoline didn't flinch. She reached into her bag, her movements slow and deliberate, and pulled out a worn, leather-bound book, her father's annotated copy of Josephus's Antiquities. The pages were yellowed, marked with her father's careful handwriting, a testament to years of study. "This isn't Wikipedia," she said softly, holding the book up. "It's history." The room hushed, the air thick with anticipation. The students, who moments ago had laughed at Hargrove's quips, now leaned forward, their phones still raised, capturing every second. Emily, the teaching assistant, stood by the door, her arms no longer crossed, her smirk gone. She shifted uncomfortably, her sharp eyes darting between Karoline and the book, as if reassessing the young woman she'd dismissed. Karoline's calm was unsettling, not because it was aggressive, but because it was unshakable. She wasn't shouting or gesturing wildly. She was simply standing there, holding a book that carried more weight than any of Hargrove's slides. If you've ever been underestimated, only to know you hold a truth no one expects, you'd feel the quiet strength in her stance. Her fingers brushed the book's cover, tracing the familiar texture, a tether to her father's lessons, to the nights spent poring over texts not for argument's sake, but for understanding. Then came the twist, sudden and electric, like a spark igniting dry grass. A student in the middle row, a girl with braided hair and wide eyes, gasped, her phone nearly slipping from her hand. "Wait," she whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Isn't she Karoline Leavitt, the White House spokesperson?" Her voice carried, rippling through the room, and heads turned, murmurs spreading like wildfire. The lanky boy beside Karoline froze, his eyes darting to her face, searching for confirmation. Another student pulled up his phone, scrolling frantically. And there it was, a viral X post from weeks ago, a photo of Karoline at a press briefing, her name captioned in bold. The lecture hall buzzed, the energy shifting as students whispered, typed, and recorded. TikTok live streams lighting up with hashtags. Hargrove's eyes narrowed, his knuckles whitening on the podium. "You expect me to believe you're some political hotshot," he snapped, his voice louder now. But it wavered, betraying a crack in his confidence. He glanced at the students, then back at Karoline, as if trying to gauge whether this was a bluff. Karoline didn't confirm or deny. She just stood there, her silence louder than his bluster, her gaze steady and unflinching. The book in her hands felt heavier now, not just because of its age, but because it was a bridge to her past, to the person she was before the White House, before the cameras and the titles. She wasn't here to flaunt her position. She hadn't even meant for it to come up. But the truth has a way of slipping out, doesn't it? Her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. She could feel her father's words echoing in her mind. "Stand firm, but don't let anger speak for you." She wasn't angry, not in the way Hargrove might have expected. Her resolve was quieter, rooted in a faith and a knowledge that no amount of scorn could shake. The students were no longer just watching, they were leaning in, some nodding, others typing furiously. The moment spilling beyond the lecture hall, Emily took a step forward, her expression unreadable, her earlier certainty gone. She looked at Karoline, then at Hargrove, as if caught between loyalty to her professor and a dawning realization that she might have misjudged. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in on Hargrove, whose smirk had all but vanished. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came, his usual eloquence faltering under the weight of Karoline's quiet evidence and the students' shifting allegiance. Phones were raised higher, their screens a constellation of tiny lights, broadcasting the moment to the world. Karoline set the book down on her desk, her movements slow, almost reverent. She didn't need to say more, not yet. Her silence was enough, a challenge Hargrove couldn't ignore. The girl with the braids whispered to her friend, her voice barely audible but urgent. "He's not going to let this go, is he?" Hargrove's eyes flicked to the door, then back to Karoline. And for the first time, he looked uncertain. The lecture hall at the University of New Hampshire pulsed with a restless energy, the kind that hums when a moment teeters on the edge of something bigger. Karoline Leavitt stood in the back row, her gray sweater and quiet demeanor no longer blending into the background. The room was a sea of faces, some curious, others stunned, all fixed on her as the door swung open and a man in a crisp suit stepped inside. Dr. Reynolds, the university dean, moved with a calm authority, his presence shifting the air like a tide. He'd been alerted by a student's live stream, the moment already spiraling beyond the lecture hall's walls. "Mrs. Leavitt, please continue," he said, his voice neutral but commanding. Cutting through the murmurs, Karoline nodded, her hazel eyes steady, and took a slow breath. She wasn't just speaking to Hargrove, now she was speaking to everyone. "Professor," she began, her voice clear and measured. "You dismiss historical sources like Tacitus and Josephus because they challenge your narrative. But truth doesn't bend to convenience." Her words were precise, each one a carefully placed stone dismantling Hargrove's argument. She cited primary sources, Tacitus's Annals, Josephus's Antiquities, with a clarity that made the room lean in. Students murmured, some nodding, a few clapping softly, their phones still raised, capturing every word. Hargrove's face reddened, his hands gripping the podium as if it could anchor his unraveling authority. "This is irrelevant," he stammered, his voice louder than necessary. But it cracked under the weight of the dean's presence. Dr. Reynolds stood near the front, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable but attentive. Emily, the teaching assistant, no longer leaned against the doorframe. Her arms had fallen to her sides, her earlier scorn replaced by wide-eyed awe. She watched Karoline with a mix of disbelief and something softer, like the first stirrings of respect. If you've ever seen someone stand up when everyone else stayed silent, you'd know the quiet power in that moment. Karoline's cross necklace glinted under the fluorescent lights as she spoke, a subtle symbol of the resolve that had carried her this far. She wasn't here to preach or to win a debate for sport. She was here because truth mattered not just to her, but to anyone who'd ever felt their beliefs reduced to a punchline. Her fingers brushed the edge of her notebook, where her father's lessons lived in her neat handwriting. She could almost hear his voice, steady and warm, from those evenings at their kitchen table. "Speak with love, Karoline. But speak." That love was in her voice now, not as anger, but as a deep, unshakable conviction. The students weren't just listening, they were shifting, their earlier amusement fading into something closer to admiration. The lanky boy beside her, his earbuds long forgotten, whispered to his friend, "She's killing it." His friend didn't respond, too busy recording, the video already racking up views on TikTok. Social media was exploding outside the lecture hall's walls. Karoline Hargrove trended on X, with clips of her speech spreading like wildfire. Comments poured in, "Who is this girl? She's schooling him." "This is why you don't mess with facts." The room felt smaller now, the world pressing in through those tiny screens, amplifying Karoline's voice far beyond what she'd intended. She hadn't come here for fame or viral moments. She'd come to ask a question, to challenge a dismissal that had cut deeper than Hargrove could know. But the truth has a way of taking on a life of its own, doesn't it? Hargrove's eyes darted to the dean, then back to Karoline, his confidence crumbling under the weight of her calm precision. He opened his mouth, his voice rising in a last-ditch effort to regain control. "You're just a publicity stunt," he snapped, pointing at her, his finger trembling slightly. The accusation hung in the air, sharp and desperate, but it landed flat. "Dr." Reynolds raised a hand, a subtle gesture that silenced Hargrove instantly. The dean's eyes met Karoline's, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition, as if he knew more than he was letting on. Karoline didn't smile or nod, she simply held his gaze, her silence a kind of strength that didn't need words. The students were clapping louder now, not a roar, but a steady rhythm, a collective acknowledgement that something had shifted. Emily took a step closer to the front, her expression conflicted, her earlier loyalty to Hargrove wavering. She glanced at Karoline, then at the book still open on her desk, its worn pages a quiet rebuke to Hargrove's scorn. The room was alive with whispers, with the soft buzz of phones, with the weight of a moment that felt bigger than any one person. Karoline set her pen down, her hands steady, her heart racing but her mind clear. She hadn't planned for this. Not the dean, Not the live streams, not the applause, but she was ready for whatever came next. Just when it seemed she'd won, Hargrove's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he leaned forward. What would he say now? The lecture hall at the University of New Hampshire was alive with a current that hadn't been there an hour ago. The air crackled, not with anger, but with the weight of a moment unfolding, one that would linger long after the students left. Karoline Leavitt stood in the back row, her gray sweater and quiet posture no longer invisible. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I'm not here for publicity, Professor," she said, her words soft but piercing, aimed at Daniel Hargrove, whose face was now a mask of strain and whose bravado was crumbling like dry leaves. "I'm here because truth matters." She turned to the students, her hazel eyes soft but unflinching, meeting their gazes one by one. "You deserve better than mockery disguised as scholarship." The room erupted in applause, not a roar, but a steady, heartfelt rhythm, like rain after a long drought. Students clapped, some standing, others nodding, their phones still recording, but their focus entirely on her. Karoline's cross necklace caught the light, a quiet symbol of the faith that had carried her through this moment, not as a weapon, but as a shield. Hargrove slumped in his chair at the front, his shoulders sagging, his earlier confidence reduced to a flicker. He opened his mouth, but no words came, his usual eloquence drowned out by the sound of the students' approval. His eyes darted to Dr. Reynolds, the dean, who stood near the podium, his expression unreadable but his presence a silent verdict. Emily, the teaching assistant, who had spent the lecture smirking from the doorway, now stepped forward, her movements hesitant, her sharp features softened by something new. Doubt, maybe, or the beginnings of courage. "She's right," Emily said, her voice trembling but clear. "I've read Josephus, too. He does mention Jesus." The words were simple, but they landed like a blow. Hargrove's head snapped up, his eyes wide with betrayal, the sting of his own assistant turning against him sharper than the students' cheers. Emily's face flushed, but she didn't look away, her gaze fixed on Karoline, who offered her a small, almost imperceptible nod. The applause grew louder, a wave that seemed to lift Karoline, though she stood as still as ever. If you've ever spoken up when silence was easier, you'd know the weight of that moment, not triumph, but responsibility. She hadn't planned for this, hadn't wanted the spotlight, but here she was, her voice carrying a truth she'd learned from her father's kitchen table, from nights spent tracing the lines of ancient texts. "Truth doesn't need to shout," her father had said, his voice warm with conviction. "It just needs someone to speak it." She'd spoken it now, and the room was listening. The students weren't just clapping, they were shifting, their earlier amusement or indifference replaced by something deeper, a recognition that this wasn't just about a lecture gone wrong. It was about what they'd been taught to question, what they'd been told to dismiss. Karoline's heart raced, not from fear, but from the realization that her words had reached beyond her, beyond this room, into a world she couldn't see, outside the lecture hall. The moment was exploding. On TikTok, clips of Karoline's speech were racking up millions of views, snippets of her calm, measured voice trending under Karoline Hargrove. X was ablaze with posts. "This girl just schooled a professor, faith and facts in one speech," legend. The comments poured in, some praising her courage, others debating her sources, but all amplifying her words to an audience she'd never imagined. She didn't know it yet, standing there with her notebook still open, but her speech was becoming a spark, igniting conversations in dorm rooms, coffee shops, and living rooms across the country. The lecture hall felt smaller now, the world pressing in through those tiny phone screens, carrying Karoline's voice to places she'd never been. She wasn't here for fame, she'd come to ask a question, to challenge a dismissal that had cut deeper than Hargrove could understand. But the truth has a way of growing, doesn't it? Hargrove's face was pale now, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the podium, his eyes flicking to the dean as if seeking rescue. "Doctor," Reynolds nodded once, a subtle gesture, but it was enough to signal that this wasn't over. His presence was a reminder that Hargrove's words, his mockery, would have consequences beyond this room, and that was when the truth didn't need to shout anymore. Karoline's calm, her evidence, her faith they'd done the speaking. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't lashed out, hadn't needed to. She'd let the truth stand straight, just as her father had taught her. The students were still clapping, some calling out, "Keep going," but Karoline didn't. She closed her notebook, her movements slow and deliberate, and began gathering her things. Her cross necklace felt warm against her skin, a quiet reminder of why she'd spoken at all. She wasn't here to win, she was here to end a lie. As she slipped her book into her bag, a student approached, a girl with braided hair and nervous eyes, holding out her phone. "You need to see this," she said, her voice urgent, her hands trembling as she turned the screen toward Karoline. The room was still buzzing, Hargrove still silent, Emily still standing awkwardly near the front. But Karoline's focus narrowed to the phone. What was on the screen? She leaned closer, her breath catching, sensing that whatever it was would change this moment again. The lecture hall at the University of New Hampshire was quieter now, the earlier applause fading into a soft hum of voices and the rustle of students gathering their things. Karoline Leavitt stood by her desk in the back row, her gray sweater slightly rumpled, her notebook still open to the page where she'd written her father's lessons. The air felt lighter, as if the truth she'd spoken had cleared a weight from the room. A girl with braided hair approached, her eyes nervous but earnest, holding out her phone. "You need to see this," she said, her voice trembling with urgency. Karoline leaned closer, her breath catching as the screen lit up with a viral X post, a video of her father, a pastor with graying hair and a warm, weathered face, speaking to a small crowd outside his church. "That's my daughter," he said, his voice thick with pride, his eyes shining. "She stood up for what's right, and I couldn't be prouder." Karoline's eyes welled up, the weight of the day finally hitting her like a wave she hadn't seen coming. She hadn't spoken to her father in weeks, too caught up in her White House duties, the endless briefings and late nights that had pulled her away from home. Seeing him now, his familiar voice carrying across the digital divide, brought a rush of memories sitting at his kitchen table, his Bible open, his hands tracing the words as he taught her to seek truth with both heart and mind. Her throat tightened, not from sadness, but from the sudden, overwhelming sense of connection, of being seen by the one person who'd always known her. If you've ever felt alone in a fight, only to find someone you love standing with you, you'd know that ache in her chest. Her fingers brushed the cross necklace, warm against her skin, a quiet reminder of the faith that had anchored her through this moment. She blinked back tears, her lips curving into a small, unsteady smile. Dr. Reynolds, the dean, approached, his suit crisp but his expression softened by something like respect. "Ms. Leavitt," he said, his voice low, meant only for her. "You've done this university a service today." His words were simple, but they carried a weight, an acknowledgement that what had happened here wasn't just a debate, it was a reckoning. Karoline nodded, her voice catching as she murmured, "Thank you," across the room. Professor Daniel Hargrove was packing his laptop, his movements jerky, his face pale. He muttered something about misunderstandings under his breath, but his eyes avoided Karoline's, avoided the students, avoided the dean. He slipped out the side door, his usual swagger gone, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than his earlier bravado. Hargrove wasn't a villain in the way some might imagine, not cruel, not evil, but his arrogance had been his undoing, and now he was facing its cost. Students crowded around Karoline, their voices overlapping, some thanking her, others asking for selfies, their phones still out, capturing the aftermath. "You were amazing," one said, a boy with glasses and a shy smile. "I didn't know you could do that," said another, the girl with braids, her eyes still wide with awe. Karoline smiled, her responses soft, almost hesitant, as if she wasn't used to this kind of attention. She hadn't come here for praise, she'd come to ask a question, to challenge a dismissal that had cut deeper than she'd expected. But the students' warmth, their gratitude, was a kind of healing, a reminder that her words had reached them, had mattered. Emily, the teaching assistant, lingered nearby, her earlier confidence replaced by a quiet unease. She stepped forward, holding out a paper cup of coffee, a small gesture of amends. I didn't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Karoline took the coffee, her eyes meeting Emily's, and nodded. "It's okay," she said, and there was no judgment in her voice, only understanding. The lecture hall was emptying now, students filing out, their phones buzzing with notifications as Karoline Hargrove continued to trend on X and TikTok. Clips of her speech, her calm dismantling of Hargrove's arguments, were being shared across the country, sparking debates in comment sections and group chats. Karoline didn't know the full scope of it, yet she didn't need to. She felt the cross necklace against her skin, its warmth a quiet anchor, and thought of her father's words from years ago. "You don't make trouble, Karoline. Sometimes you're in trouble, and you stand up." She'd stood up today, not for herself, but for the truth, for the students, for the faith that had shaped her. The room was nearly empty now, just a few stragglers and Dr. Reynolds, who was speaking quietly with a faculty member near the podium. Karoline slipped her notebook into her bag, her hands steady but her heart full, the weight of the day settling into something softer, something like peace. But as she turned to leave, Dr. Reynolds called her name, his tone gentle but firm. "Ms. Leavitt, a moment, please," he said, gesturing toward the front. Karoline paused, her bag slung over her shoulder, her eyes curious but calm. What did he want to say? Weeks had passed since that charged afternoon in the University of New Hampshire lecture hall. But the echo of Karoline Leavitt's words lingered, not just in the minds of those who'd been there, but across the country. The university had announced a review of its lecture policies, a quiet but significant step prompted by the viral moment that had unfolded when Karoline stood up to Professor Daniel Hargrove. The news came in a press release, tucked into the university's website, but it was shared widely on X, with comments praising the change. About time they rethink how professors talk about faith. Hargrove himself had taken a leave of absence, his reputation dented but not shattered. Some said he was writing a book, others that he was lying low, waiting for the storm to pass. Karoline didn't follow the rumors. She didn't need to. Her life had moved on, back to the whirlwind of her White House roll press briefings, policy memos, and late-night flights. But the speech she'd given, those few minutes of calm, measured truth, lived on, shared across X and TikTok, clipped and reposted, debated and celebrated. It had become something bigger than her, a spark for conversations about faith, reason, and the courage to speak when silence is easier. Karoline sat now at a small diner in her hometown, a place with checkered tablecloths and the smell of coffee and pie, the kind of spot where time seemed to pause. Across from her was her father, his gray hair catching the soft light, his hands folded around a mug. They hadn't seen each other in months, her schedule pulling her away from these quiet moments. But tonight, they were here, just the two of them, the hum of the diner a gentle backdrop. He looked at her, his eyes warm with the same pride she'd seen in that viral video, and squeezed her hand. "You spoke for those who couldn't, Karoline," he said, his voice low but steady, the words carrying the weight of years spent teaching her to stand firm. Her throat tightened, not from sadness, but from the deep, grounding love that had always been her anchor. She smiled, her fingers brushing the cross necklace that rested against her skin, its familiar warmth a reminder of why she'd stood up that day. She didn't gloat over what had happened, there was no need. The victory wasn't in Hargrove's retreat or the university's policy review. It was in the students who'd approached her afterward, their voices soft with gratitude, saying they'd felt seen. It was in the messages she'd received, some from strangers, thanking her for reminding them that faith and reason could coexist. If you've ever done something not for yourself, but for those who needed to hear it, you'd know the quiet satisfaction in her heart. The memory of that lecture hall lingered, not as a triumph, but as a reminder of what courage costs. She'd felt the weight of every eye in that room, the sting of Hargrove's mockery, the pressure of speaking when she could have stayed silent. But she'd spoken, not with anger, but with a clarity that had shifted something, however small, in the world around her. Back in Washington, her colleagues had seen the viral clips, some teasing her gently about her moment of fame, others asking quiet questions about her faith. She answered with the same calm she'd shown in the lecture hall, not preaching, but sharing what she knew, what she'd studied, what she believed. The cross necklace, a gift from her father when she was a teenager, was a constant now, no longer tucked beneath her collar but worn openly, a subtle declaration of who she was. She thought of Emily, the teaching assistant, who'd handed her that coffee, her eyes full of regret and something like hope. Karoline had written her a short note before leaving New Hampshire, thanking her for stepping forward, for finding her own courage. She didn't know if Emily had read it, but she hoped it had mattered. The diner was quieter now, the evening crowd thinning, the waitress wiping down tables with a slow, steady rhythm. Karoline's father leaned back, his mug empty, and told her about his church, about the people who'd seen her speech and wanted to meet her. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "I didn't do it for that, Dad," she said, and he nodded, understanding. The truth she'd spoken wasn't loud, but it was lasting, like a stone dropped in a still pond, its ripples spreading far beyond her sight. There's a kind of justice that doesn't need noise, she thought, watching the steam rise from her coffee. It just needs someone brave enough to step forward. Karoline had done that, leaving behind a truth too loud to ignore, not because she'd shouted, but because she'd stood. As they paid the bill and stepped into the cool night air, her father put an arm around her shoulders, the gesture as familiar as the cross around her neck. They walked toward his car, the stars bright above the small town, and Karoline felt a peace that hadn't been there before. She'd go back to Washington tomorrow, back to the noise and the pressure, but tonight, she was home. What would the next day bring? Karoline's cross necklace caught the diner's soft light, a silent testament to the truth she'd carried. The room didn't cheer, but it felt fuller, as if courage had settled into the cracks of doubt. Was that justice not loud, not vengeful, just a quiet shift in the air? Sometimes, the smallest voice leaves the deepest echo, reminding us that standing for truth isn't about winning, but about showing others they can stand too.